Hello again and welcome back to another FMOD and Unity tutorial where today we're going to be looking at how we can implement parameters from FMOD into Unity and all the new types of code commands they've added into FMOD 2.0. Before we start, I just want to give you guys another quick reminder that the FMOD and Unity Essentials course will be on its way very soon, starting from Monday the 2nd of September and ending on the 8th of September. So if you're interested in a course that provides you with everything you need to implement your audio from FMOD into Unity and create your own dynamic soundscapes in an interactive way, make sure to keep an eye on this page. You can even go to my website, which I'll have linked in the description, and you can sign up to the newsletter where you'll not only get a free lesson from the course, but you'll also be able to follow any news and updates about it and finding out more information about when and how it will be released. I've also got some ideas to give away some discount codes and even some free copies of the course, so make sure you keep an eye on these channels if you're interested. But with that done, let's have a look at our code that we'll be looking at today. So like I said, the aim for today is to look at all the new ways that with FMOD 2.0 we can implement and control our parameters from FMOD. So what I've done is I've created a little scene in Unity, and in that scene I've created a few scripts to go along with it. Now these scripts, all in different ways, will control some parameters I've created in FMOD that control how we hear the background ambience in that scene. So we'll start by giving ourselves a little bit of background on the event we're using in FMOD so we can understand how the scripts work in Unity. Okay, so like I said, this event is going to trigger a simple 2D ambience to play. Now as you can see, I've got two tracks here, one called Nature and one called City. Well, depending on the setting that our parameter is set to in our game, or which value it will be set to, we'll hear either one of these two ambiences. So let's quickly start by having a listen to them. The first one is a more nature, outdoorsy environment sound. So pretty simple stuff, just some birds, some crickets, and like a little background buzz with some insects floating around. The second ambience is more of a urban city ambience. Okay, so two pretty simple ambiences. A few things to note about this event. The first thing is that there is a parameter attached. This one's called ambience fade, and like I said, depending on the value this parameter is at, we'll hear either one of these two ambiences. As you might be able to see here, I've automated these two tracks. So when the ambience is at 0, we hear the nature one. And when the ambience fade is at 1, we hear the city ambience. You might also notice that the regions themselves are actually in the ambience parameter sheet as opposed to the timeline. Well, that's because these regions are going to loop anyway in the game. We're not going to really tell them to stop, or they're not going to stop once the cursor reaches the end. They're going to play again. So there's no point putting them on the timeline. The only time they will stop is when we want them to stop, which will be at the end of a scene or something, which we'll do in code. So it makes sense for us to add them to the parameter sheet itself. This is also quite nice because it means we can see the region playing as we can also see the automation to it. All in the same place. So because any regions or any instruments you add to a parameter sheet become asynchronous, which means that they just play back separately from the cursor you see on the parameter sheet, we want these to loop. And the way we make asynchronous regions loop is by selecting the region, and we just click the little loop button here, which I've done for both of them, and we just make sure they're going to loop infinitely. Now if we come up to the parameter itself, right click and select edit parameter, we can see that it is a continuous parameter. As of FMOD 2.0, there was a lot of different parameter types added. It doesn't really matter which type you go for in terms of implementing it into Unity. The type basically just makes it easier for you to, control how the sound will be manipulated by the parameter. So continuous basically sets the min and max value of the parameter, which in my case is 0 and 1. And includes decimal places in between those values. If we go back, you can see that any number between 0 and 1, our parameter can be set to. Now, if on the other hand it was a discrete parameter, we could only have the option of setting it to either 0 or 1. So if I quickly click on that and click OK, this is going to look a bit weird, but if I can zoom out a bit, you can see that the only option it can be set to is 0 or 1, which isn't really ideal for fading between two ambiances like this. So I'm just going to quickly undo that and go back to continuous. So the final user parameter type is called labeled, and basically with labeled it acts the same way as discrete. You can only have one or the other, or rather with you can only select whole numbers when setting the value of the parameter. The difference is that you can give names to each of those values. And this doesn't translate into Unity or your code. The code, in terms of code, you'll still communicate with the parameter in terms of its value. However, when working in FMOD, it's a lot easier if you can see what your values do by naming them. So for example, if I was using this to fade in between my ambiances, I might call the first one fade to nature and the second one fade to city, for example. Now the rest of the parameters are all built-in parameters, which means that we don't have to do any coding when using them in Unity, and they're all going to adjust different properties and settings depending on the location between where this event is played and where our studio listener component is in FMOD, which is a component we attach to a game object and acts as the player's ears where they hear everything from. So we're not really going to look too much into these today. If you want to learn more about them, however, we'll have a link in the description to the FMOD website where you can read up about how they work. But for this, we want a continuous parameter. So once you've chosen your type and then you've given your parameter its name, the range of values it can be, and where it's going to start, you can choose a parameter scope. You can choose to make the parameter either local or global. Now this is something really cool that's been added to FMOD 2.0. In previous versions, you could only have your parameters as local. This meant that if I had, say, 5 events that all had this parameter on, I'd have to set the value of that parameter for each event individually. So the first event could have a value of 0.2, the second can have a value of 0.5, the third could have 0.6, and so on. They'd all be different, and if I wanted them all to be the same, I'd have to manually tell each instance of that parameter to, be the same value. Now, however, we can set the parameter to global, which means that all I have to do is tell this parameter to switch to a certain value, and then all instances of the parameter being used in all of our events will switch to that value. So I could have my 5 events, each one of them has my parameter attached to it, and if I say set the ambience fade parameter to 0.2, they'd all switch to 0.2. Now this is something we're going to be looking at later on because the way you interact with local and global parameters in your code is slightly different. So I'm just going to set mine back to local for now. Underneath parameter scope, we have some additional options, which I'm quickly going to run through you now. So exposed recursively, I think that says, I can't even read that word, via event instruments, basically means that if we were to have this event nested as a child event inside another, we could interact with this parameter that controls our child event from the parent event. Read only is pretty straightforward. It basically means that in code we will not be able to interact with this parameter. However, we can change it within FMOD using things like modulation. And the final one, hold value during playback, basically means that if you set a parameter to a value and then play the event, you won't be able to change that parameter until the event has stopped playing. Now with local parameters, each instance of the parameter is tied to the event instance that's using it. So if you set a value of a parameter and played the event it's attached to, you wouldn't be able to change that parameter until the event has finished playing. However, if you're using a global parameter, the parameter is not tied to any event. It's basically just you could think of it almost as a parameter that's always on whilst the game is running. It's actually tied to something which we'll look at a little bit in code later. But just note that if you set your parameter to global and then tick the hold value during playback option, you won't be able to change it in code at all. This is because essentially the parameter is constantly playing back whilst the game is running, and unless you want to switch off the FMOD system in your game completely and turn it back on again, there's no way of turning that parameter off. So it's best not to use this unless you don't want to change it, unless you're using local parameters. But with that talked about, that's pretty much everything on the FMOD side, so it's time to have a look at the scene I've set up for you. So what I've got here is a little man, a first-person controller, which I can control, and I've got a big, massive trigger box that I've kept the collider on, or the the mesh of the box, just so we can see it. The idea is that when we're outside the box, we will hear the nature ambience, but when I walk in and trigger the collider or the trigger area that is the box, we will hear the city ambience and tell our parameters to switch values from 0 to 1. Now to do that, we've got 4 different scripts that all do the same thing but in different ways. So let's have a look at the first one, which is parameters set by name. Okay, so this script is nice and simple, so let's walk you through it. The first thing we do is create an event instance of the event we created earlier, which was ambience. And I've just called it ambience for the sake of ease, so we know which event it's an instance of. Then in the start function, or on the first frame that the game is run, we're going to set the value of this variable to an instance of our event. And we do that by using fmodunity.runtimemanager.createInstance and then feeding it the event path to our ambience event. A quick way to find an event path, by the way, is by going into Unity, clicking the FMOD tab at the top, selecting Event Browser, open the Events folder, select your event, and then from here, it will not only tell you the event path, but you can also copy it and then paste it into your code. Now you want to feed this as string data, so make sure you have quotation marks either side of the event path. Great, so now we have our event instance variable and we have referenced the event we want to store inside of it. So next all we need to do is tell it to play, which I've done by using the start function. Perfect, so now our event's playing and we can hear the nature ambience, which by the way is the ambience I've set to as the default one. So with parameters, as I mentioned earlier, you get to choose an initial value where it's going to start at. I've chosen 0, which means the first ambience we'll hear will be the nature one. So next we want to set up the parameter to trigger when we enter the trigger area. So I'm using the onTriggerEnter function, as you can see here. As you can see, inside the parameter brackets of the function, I've created a variable of the collider type and called it other. So we can use this variable now to check whatever enters our area. Now I want to check for my first person controller. So in an if statement, I've said if other.name, basically meaning check the name of whatever enters the area, is the same as FPS controller, which I've entered as a string, then we know our player has entered the area and we can look at changing our parameter. So it's here that we look at the first line of code that can change the value of a parameter. So what you do is you find your event instance variable that has the instance of the parameter you're using. Remember our parameter in FMOD, we have, if I can quickly open it, we've left as local. So we need to access the parameter through the event instance using it. So you write the name of your event instance or the variable holding the instance of your event, and you write .setParameterByName. So we're going to set the value of this parameter and we're going to find it by searching for its name. Now its name is ambience fade. So in the brackets next to this function, the first argument is, well, its name. Once you've entered its name, you can then enter the value you want to set it to. So I'm going to set mine to 1. Now this command can take either integers or float values. Float values, remember, can be any number at all, but integers can only be whole numbers. The little f next to the number basically means it is a float value. And if we removed it, we would be essentially feeding this an integer. Now remember, because my parameter is continuous, and it can be any number essentially, if I wanted to, I could set this to 0.675, for example, and put an F next to it. However, I couldn't do that if it was discrete or labeled, because our parameter will only accept whole numbers. Another thing I couldn't do is feed that as an integer, because that's not an integer. As you can see, I've got a little error line. It has to be a whole number if you're going to feed it as an integer. Alternatively, you could create a float or integer variable, call it, I don't know, value, set that to say 1, and then feed that into the parameter like that. And if you're going to call this setParameterByName command quite a lot, it makes sense to do that. In fact, if you're using, a system that's been built to handle information, it's going to control your parameter in the first place by the game, you probably won't just be feeding it, raw data like that. You'll probably have a variable of some type knocking around your game code for you to use. But seeing this is just a demonstration, I'm just going to leave mine as 1 and make things easier for us to see. So those 2 arguments are essential. If you're going to use this, you have to add the name and the value you want to set it to for it to work. Alternatively, you can add a boolean, which is basically either true or false, to say whether or not you want to ignore the seek speed options you set on your parameter. Now that's actually something I forgot to show you. So let me quickly go back to FMOD and show you how to access seek speed. So what that is a way of fading into the value you're setting your parameter to in your code. So obviously in my code I'm setting this parameter to 1, but I don't want the cursor to jump straight to 1. I want it to fade into it. So if we, if we go to FMOD, if we click on the parameter at the top, we get this option to look at the seek speed. Basically, we can set the value per second in which our parameter changes by. So I've set mine to change by value of 0.6 per second whenever I'm telling my parameter to change value in my code. So if I played my event and then quickly set it to 1, you'll see the cursor slowly fade into it. Now, if for some reason whilst your game's running you wanted to ignore that seek speed option that you set, you can, in your code, write after your first two arguments, you can write true, just like that. And again, just like with the float, in fact, you can do this with strings as well. You can create a variable which you feed into it instead of the Boolean type. But seeing as we need the seek speed and we won't ever want to, tell it to be ignored, I'm just going to remove this argument as it's not necessary. And the final thing I've done in this script is I've set an onTrigger exit function. This time, this function is going to be triggered when the player exits the trigger area. Basically works the same way. We're checking to see if it's the player that's exiting the trigger area, not anything else. And if it is, we want to set the parameter ambience phase that we're using inside the ambience event to 0. So setParameterByName is pretty much your go-to. It's like your default way of controlling parameters. It's nice and easy, and you can pretty much use it with any parameter in FMOD. So let's quickly jump into Unity and have a listen to how that sounds. So outside of the box, we can hear the nature ambience. But if we walk inside, we hear the city. And then walk out the box and hear nature again. Cool, nice and simple. So let's now have a look at the next script, and I'm going to quickly disable the first one and enable the second one, so when I test it later it will work. Let's open it up and have a look at the second way you can interact with local parameters. So this script is pretty much designed the same way as the first one does, and it will achieve the same effect. We are creating the ambience event instance, and we are telling it to start in the first frame. And on the on enter trigger and on trigger exit functions, we are telling our parameter to change values. The way we change the values, however, is different. Let's have a look at the new variables we've created in order to interact with our event. The first one is of the event description type. Now you'll use this variable whenever you want to interact with your event through code and find out information about it. So you can find out how long it's been playing for, which instance of this event is playing, I don't know, how many tracks is playing. There's all sorts of data you can pull from this variable when you tell it to interact with a specific instance. Now we're only going to be using it for looking at one particular piece of information about our event, but if you want to learn all the other ways you can use them, I'll have links to the FMOD documentation in the description for you. So inside the start function, we are going to set the value of ambient description, which is what I've called my event description variable. We're going to set it to an instance of the ambience event. And we're going to do that by using the getEventDescription function. You can access this function by writing fmodunity.runtimeManager.getEventDescription. So now, just like the ambience event, we now have an instance of an event inside our event description variable. And the next thing we want to do is use this variable to get a description of a specific parameter that this event is using. Now to do that, we use this function here, getParameterDescription by name. So we write the name of our event description variable, then we write .getParameterDescription by name, and then we feed it two arguments. The first is just like we did in the other script, we feed it a string of the name of our parameter. The second, we actually want to output data instead of feeding this function data, which is why we wrote out before the actual argument. So we're going to output the description and all the information we can pull out from this parameter into the PD variable. And the PD variable is another new variable type, and that type is parameter description, as you can see here. So this is very similar to the event description data type or event data type. Whilst event description can hold lots of different information about the event, parameter description focuses on parameters specifically, and therefore only can tell you a few specific pieces of information about a specific parameter. So now, using the PD variable, we can access information about our ambience fade parameter through our code. Now, the piece of information we are after specifically is the parameter's ID. Now, every parameter in FMOD has an ID, and that ID consists of two, I guess, strings, or, well, they're not strings, two basically chunks of integer numbers. What we want to do is find out the ID of our ambience fade parameter through this code so that we can use that instead of its name whenever we want to reference that parameter and change its values. So now that we have a reference to our ambience fade parameter inside PD, we can access its ID by writing, as you can see here, pd.id. Now, because the ID of a parameter is its own data type, it's not of the integer data type, it needs its own variable of that data type. So as you can see at the top, I've got our third and final new variable, PID, which is of the parameter underscore ID data type. Then inside the start function, I am setting the value of that to whatever the ID of our ambience fade parameter is. So now, going forward, we can access our ambience fade parameter's ID via this variable, which is exactly what I've done in our onEnter and onExit functions. Instead of using setParameterByName, I'm now using setParameterByID. And instead of feeding it a string, which would be our parameter's name, I'm feeding it that variable, which holds the ID of our parameter. Now you might be thinking, Henry, okay, I get it. I know how that would work, but why would I ever do that if I can just simply write setParameterByName and then not have to add all of these extra events and all this extra description in the start function? Well, the reason why is because whenever we want to check something in our code or compare something by using a string or string data, that actually takes longer for our CPU and our game to do than by checking integers and number data. So if you were interacting with your parameter quite a lot of times in your game, you probably wouldn't want to use setParameterByName because that's going to slow your game down, and every time you call it, that's obviously going to stack up. It's going to take longer for the code to find the parameter. That's going to slow the performance of your game down. You could even lose a couple of frames because of it if you're doing it enough times. So while setParameterByName is definitely the easiest option, and if you're only going to change your parameter once or twice, it's definitely the preferred option, you're better off using setByID if you're going to be interacting with your parameter lots of times in order to improve the performance of your game. With it, all you have to do is set all of these variables and all of these lines of code up once, and you're done. From then on, you can use setParameterByID whenever you want to interact with a parameter. So in the long run, setByID is definitely the more efficient way of interacting with it. One final tip when using setByID you can do is you can actually cut out the parameter ID variable altogether, and let's quickly get rid of that as well. And instead of feeding the setParameterByID function a variable, you can just feed it the ID directly by going through the parameter description variable. So just like how we set the PID variable in the start function to the ID of our parameter by writing pd.id, we can do the same in this function. However, the whole point of this method is, like I said earlier, to kind of make your code more efficient and improve performance. And if you're going to be using setParameterByID a lot, which I assume you will be, you'll want to make your code as efficient as possible. So doing it this way doesn't really make sense. It's definitely more efficient to create a variable once and then access the ID through that. But now we understand the code, let's go back into Unity and let's double check that it does the same thing as our first code did. So again, we can hear nature, go into the box. We can hear the city, walk out again. And we can hear nature again. Okay, now it's time to mix things up a bit. What would happen if instead of interacting with a local parameter, we wanted to instead interact with a global parameter. Well, let's have a look at the code that we need to write for that. But first, I'm going to set mine to global, click OK, press F7 to build my new data, my new banks into my game, and hit save to save the project. Then in Unity, I'm going to look at my first new script that looks at global parameters and open it up for you guys to see. Okay, so just like before, the first way of interacting with a global parameter is using setParameterByName. Now again, for efficiency's sake, it's best to use setParameterByName if you're only going to be interacting with the parameter a few times in your game. Now the script itself I've written is pretty much identical to my first one I created earlier for the local parameter. The difference is, however, how I'm interacting with the parameter. So, instead of interacting with it via my ambience variable, which as you'll remember is a variable holding an instance, oh whoops, of the ambience event, we are instead going to access the parameter by going through the runtime manager and a struct called Studio System. Now, as I mentioned earlier, when you're using FMOD with Unity, you've basically got this kind of system that's working in the background that turns itself on and allows you to interact with your audio via FMOD. Now, it kind of handles all the messy detail bits that we're not really interested in this video anyway. So such as setting the maximum amount of audio channels you can send into your game, which is, for performance reasons, what kind of bit depth and sample rate your audio is going to be at. You go through this in order to load in your audio banks, so stuff like that. It's all the messy details that kind of handles the whole FMOD system in general. So it's through this that we need to interact with any global parameters. So in order to set the value of our ambience fade parameter, which is now global, we write fmodunity.runtimeManager.studiosystem.setParameterByName, and just like last time, we feed it a string that's the name of our parameter and the value we want to set it to. And also, just like last time, if we want to, we can say true or false whether or not we want to ignore the sync speed option, which actually reminds me, if we go back to ID, you can also do that with setParameterByID. If I wanted to, I could say true to ignore sync speed, but I don't, so I'm not going to. And what's nice about interacting with global parameters, even though I've done it here, we don't have to interact with the parameter in this script. If we wanted to, this script could simply just tell this event to play, and that'll be it. From there, we could basically create a new script, we could attach it to a completely different game object, and we could still interact with the parameter itself. Because like I said, it's global, it's not tied to an instance of an event. There's only ever one instance of it, and that's going to always be activated whilst the game and our studio system is running and is on. Okay, so just like last time, we set our onTriggerEnter function and tell our parameter to set to 1 if the player enters. If they exit the trigger area, we set it to 0. Nice and simple. So just like last time, let's have a quick test to make sure that works. So we hear nature, let's go in. We hear the city, let's go out. We hear nature, perfect. The final method I want to show you guys is interacting with global parameters using its ID. Now what's nice about this is actually a little bit easier, or I guess simpler, a little tiny bit anyway, than interacting with a parameter by its ID via an event. The reason why is because we don't need to access it through the event. Like I said, the parameter is not tied to the instance of it anymore. It's global. We can access it from whenever and wherever we want. That means that we don't need to create an event description variable to access it. If we want to get the description of the parameter by its name, we can do that through the studio system, just like we did in the last script. So in my start function, I've written fmodunity.runtimeManager.studiosystem.getParameterDescriptionByName, and again fed it the name of my parameter, and then outputted all the description information we can access into the PD variable, which is of the parameter description type. From there, I've created another variable PID of the parameter ID type, and then I've set it to the whatever's in the variable, all the information about our parameter that's in it, specifically the ID information. Then going forward, we can access that parameter via its ID. So in the onTriggerEnter function, this time we've written fmodunity.runtimeManager.studiosystem.setParameterById, And just like we did with the ID script for local parameters, we feed it the parameter ID variable and the value we want to switch it to. And again, as always, we could say true or false, but we don't want to. And of course, on the onTriggerExit function, we do the same thing, but we change the value to 0. Just like with the local parameter, if I wanted to, I could copy that. I could get rid of this variable altogether because we don't need it. And I could feed the ID straight into my functions, just like that, and it would still work. Which, like I said earlier, probably isn't the way you'd want to do it, but hopefully that kind of just helps you understand how these functions kind of work and interact with each other, what you can and can't do. For example, this is completely irrelevant, but screw it, I'm just going to show you anyway. Another way we could write this is we could get rid of the ambience variable altogether, and we could tell our event to start and access it all in one line. That would work, and we wouldn't need that, but that would be silly because now we wouldn't be able to tell it to stop at all. That's completely irrelevant to what we're talking about. I just want to share it to hopefully, like I said earlier, help you understand kind of how this code works and interacts with itself. So one final time, even though it's pretty pointless at this point, we know it'll work. Let's test the scene one more time. So, nature, enter the area. City, exit the area. Nature, perfect. So it works just like the rest of them. So with that, that's everything I wanted to show you for this video. There are a few other ways you can interact with the parameters using the ID specifically, but for today, I just wanted to leave it at that, as I feel that's kind of, you know, the basics of what you'll need, and hopefully that's all pretty understandable and easy for you guys to use. So, thanks very much for watching. If there's anything you'd like me to look at, FMOD Unity related, or even just sound and audio related for games, let me know in the comments below. Keep an eye out for the FMOD and Unity Essentials course. You can follow me on Twitter, at HenryScott0. And can't think of any more self-promotion things I want to do right now. So thank you for watching, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Yeah, the day.